Claire Bennett pressed her back flat against the cold hallway wall and stopped breathing. Her father's voice carried through the study door like a blade through thin cotton. She comes with the child. That's non-negotiable. You take both, or the deal falls apart entirely. A pause. Then laughter low, satisfied, ugly. Don't worry, Hayes. She ain't got nowhere else to go. She'll be grateful for whatever you offer her. Claire's hands curled into fists at her sides. Grateful. They were selling her, and they were laughing while they did it. If this story already has your heart, please take a moment right now and hit that subscribe button. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Claire. Because what happens next will change everything she thought she knew about what it means to be wanted. The study door did not open. Claire stood in that hallway for a long time, after the voices went quiet. Her spine pressed against the wallpaper her mother had chosen 20 years ago. Pale roses on cream already yellowing at the edges. Lily was upstairs asleep. Claire could hear nothing from up there, which meant her daughter was still safe, still dreaming, still untouched by whatever had just been decided about their lives. She waited until her heartbeat steadied. Then she walked back to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and stared at her own hands. 28 years old. One daughter. No money of her own. No land. No horse. No legal standing in a county where her father's name opened every door that mattered. And now apparently no say in where she was going next. She had escaped one cage. It appeared her family had already built her another. The next morning she came downstairs early before Lily woke before the housemaids started their rounds. Her father, Gerald Bennett, was already seated at the head of the breakfast table, with his coffee and his newspaper, every inch of him arranged, like a man who had never doubted a single decision in his life. He looked up when she entered. His expression did not change. "Sit down, Claire." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. She did not pour coffee. She did not reach for anything on the table. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him directly, the way she had learned to do in the years since Daniel, since she had understood that looking away from dangerous men only made them bolder. "I heard you last night," she said. Gerald set his newspaper down, folded it, placed it to his left with the kind of deliberate slowness that meant he was choosing his words. "Then you already know," he said, "which saves us time. Who is Ethan Hayes? A rancher, widower, runs cattle up in the Rockies, good operation, been doing it 15 years. Respectable man, quiet, keeps to himself." He lifted his coffee cup. "He's agreed to take you and Lily. Take us." Claire repeated the words carefully, like she was testing the weight of them. "You mean marry me? I mean give you a roof and a future, since you've made it abundantly clear you're incapable of arranging one for yourself. I arranged my own escape from a man who put me on the floor twice before Lily's first birthday," Claire said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "I arranged my own transport out of Daniel's house with my daughter and $14 to my name. I arranged survival without a single person in this family offering one word of help. Don't talk to me about incapable." Gerald's jaw tightened. He set the cup down. "You embarrassed this family." "I survived your choices for it, Claire." He said her name like a door slamming shut. "This conversation is already decided. Ethan Hayes is a decent man. He needs someone to help manage the household, and he's willing to take the child. You will go. You will make yourself useful, and you will stop performing this stubborn routine as though you have alternatives." "What does he know about me?" Her father blinked. It was the first question he hadn't expected. "What does he know?" she repeated slower. "About the marriage. About Daniel. About why I left." A pause stretched between them. Outside, a horse moved in the yard. Somewhere upstairs, Lily turned over in her sleep. "Enough," Gerald said finally. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting." He stood straightening his jacket with both hands. "You leave in 3 days. I suggest you use the time to prepare Lily, rather than sitting here making speeches." He picked up his newspaper and walked toward the door. "Be grateful, Claire. Not every man would take you." She did not answer him. She sat at that table alone for a long time after he left, listening to the house wake up around her. The maids, the cook, the distant sound of Lily's footsteps crossing the floor above, and she thought about the word grateful until it turned to ash in her mouth. She had 2 days to find out who Ethan Hayes was before she had to become whatever he expected her to be. She asked the woman who ran the dry goods store on Main Street because Margaret Holloway knew everything about everyone in 3 counties and had the decency to say so plainly. Ethan Hayes. Margaret did not look up from the bolt of fabric she was measuring. Mountain man, keeps a big spread up past the second ridge. Used to come down for supplies once a month real regular. Then his wife passed and he started sending a hand instead. She made a cut. That was 4 or 5 years back now. What was she like, the wife? Good woman, quiet. People liked her. Margaret set the scissors down and finally looked at Claire. You asking because of the arrangement your daddy made? Claire didn't answer. Margaret nodded like she already had. Hayes came in himself 2 weeks ago, she said. First time in years. Bought flour, salt, sugar, and... She paused, and something crossed her face that Claire couldn't immediately read. A child's picture book, the kind with colored illustrations. Claire went very still. He asked me, Margaret continued in a lower voice, whether I knew what size boots a 6-year-old girl generally wore. The silence between them stretched tight as wire. He asked about Lily, Claire said. He did. Margaret folded the fabric with careful hands. Now, I don't know the man well, Miss Claire. Can't tell you his heart. But a man who walks into a store and asks what size boots your daughter wears before he's even met you. She met Claire's eyes steadily. That ain't a man who agreed to take you as a burden. She told Lily that evening, sitting on the edge of the girl's bed, choosing each word the way you pick your way across uncertain ice. Lily was 6. She had her mother's dark hair and enormous gray eyes that had already seen too much. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her daughter that both broke Claire's heart and made it swell with fierce protective pride. Is he mean? Lily asked when Claire finished. I don't know him yet. Is he like Daddy? The question landed in Claire's chest like a stone into deep water. She kept her face still. I don't believe so, she said. But we will find out together. And Lily, if anything ever feels wrong, you come to me immediately. You understand me? You don't wait. You don't wonder. You come straight to me. Lily nodded. Then after a moment, will he let me have a dog? Claire laughed genuinely unexpectedly and pulled her daughter close. I have no idea, baby. I honestly have no idea. The morning they left, none of the Bennett family came outside to say goodbye. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrich, stood in the doorway with red eyes and pressed a small bundle of biscuits into Claire's hands without a word. The stableman helped load their 2 trunks onto the wagon without meeting Claire's eyes. The house itself seemed to exhale as they pulled away from it, relieved, or perhaps just indifferent. Lily sat beside her mother on the wagon bench, her small boot tapping a quiet, restless rhythm against the footboard, one arm wrapped around a cloth rabbit that had survived Daniel's house and 3 moves since. The driver, a weathered man named Earl who worked for Hayes, said very little. He had kind eyes and hands scarred from rope work, and he called Lily Little Miss, with the easy, automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised right. How long a ride? Claire asked him an hour into the journey. Rest of the day, ma'am. We'll make the lower ridge before dark. What's the ranch like? Earl considered this with genuine thought, which she appreciated. Big, he said. Gets bigger every year. Mr. Hayes keeps taking people in families with no place workers who got hurt somewhere else, widows with children. There's a proper bunkhouse and 3 family cabins on the north side now. Gets loud at mealtimes. He seemed to feel this required clarification. Not bad loud, full loud, like a real place. Claire turned that over in her mind. Like a real place. He built all that himself. Started it himself. Other folks helped finish it once they had reason to stay. Earl clicked his tongue at the horses around a wide curve. Mr. Hayes has a talent for making people feel like they have reason to stay. Lily had fallen asleep with her head against Claire's arm by the time the wagon began to climb. The air sharpened with altitude and pine cold in the lungs, in a way that felt clean rather than punishing. Claire watched the mountains build around them, enormous and indifferent, and terrifyingly beautiful, and tried to keep her fear inside her ribs where it belonged. She was good at that. She had been practicing for years. Ethan Hayes was standing at the fence line when the wagon rolled in. He was taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered in the way of men who work with their bodies, rather than men who merely present themselves with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had spent considerable time in weather. He wore a plain work coat worn at the elbows. His hat was off, held in both hands. He was watching the wagon approach with an expression Claire couldn't immediately categorize. Not eager. Not calculating. Not the careful performance of a man trying to make a good first impression. He looked, she thought, like a man who was nervous. That small detail rearranged something in her chest. Earl brought the wagon to a stop. Hayes stepped forward. He looked at Claire directly, not past her, not through her, but at her, the way so few people had ever bothered to, and said, "Mrs. Bennet, I'm glad you made the ride safely. The weather's been unpredictable." "Miss Bennet," Claire said. "I kept my own name when the marriage ended." Something in his expression shifted a small, clean kind of approval. "Miss Bennet," he repeated without missing a beat. "Of course." Lily had woken during the stop. She was now sitting very upright at Claire's side, studying Ethan Hayes with the direct, merciless appraisal that only a 6-year-old could produce without any awareness of its social implications. Hayes looked at her. His expression changed completely. The nervousness dissolved. In its place came something quieter, a kind of careful, earnest warmth, like a man approaching an animal that has every reason not to trust him, and understanding without resentment that the distrust is entirely fair. "You must be Lily," he said. He did not crouch to her level in that performative way adults sometimes did. He simply addressed her straight and evenly the way he'd addressed her mother. "I'm Ethan. I run this place." Lily stared at him for a long, evaluating moment. "Do you have dogs?" she asked. "3," Ethan said. "2 blue heelers and a shepherd with 1 ear. The shepherd's name is Governor, and he thinks very highly of himself." Lily considered this information with absolute seriousness. Then she said, "I want to meet Governor." "He's behind the barn," Ethan said. "I'll take you myself if your mama says it's all right." They both looked at Claire. Claire had not planned for this. She had planned for hostility. She knew how to resist for condescension. She had armor against for the dull, mechanical cruelty of a transaction made between men in which she was the item exchanged. She had not planned for a widowed mountain rancher to stand in a work coat with his hat in his hands and ask her daughter's permission before taking a single step. "It's all right," she said. Earl took the trunks. Ethan walked Lily to the barn. Claire followed 3 steps behind, watching. She watched the way he shortened his stride without making it obvious. She watched him point things out the woodpile. The water pump a crack in the fence post he said he'd been meaning to fix for weeks in the casual, unhurried way of a man showing someone around a place he expected them to stay in. Not a tour, a welcome. Behind the barn, a large gray shepherd with 1 ear and an extraordinary sense of his own dignity was lying in the dirt with his head on his paws. He lifted it when they approached. His single remaining ear swiveled forward. Lily stopped walking. "He's big," she whispered. "He is." Ethan agreed. "And he knows it. Go slow. Let him smell your hand first. Don't look straight at him right off." Lily did exactly as she was told, slowly, seriously, with the focused deliberateness of a child taking something important very seriously. She extended her hand. Governor sniffed it with all the gravity of a judge reviewing evidence. Then he rested his massive head against her palm. Lily made a sound Claire had not heard her daughter make in over a year. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Ethan did not say anything. He looked at Lily's face, and then he looked at Claire, and Claire found she could not entirely read what was in his expression, only that it was not triumph, not satisfaction with a deal well made. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. "Your daughter is brave," he said in a low voice just for Claire. "She gets it honestly," Claire said. Something moved across his face. He looked out at the yard, at the cabins along the tree line, at the mountain pressing up against the afternoon sky. "I want you to know something, Miss Bennet, before you've had time to form opinions about this place. All right, I did not agree to this arrangement as a favor to your father." He said it plainly, without drama, watching her face to make sure she was receiving it correctly. "I don't owe Gerald Bennet anything, and I made that clear to him when he first came to me. I agreed because—" He paused, chose carefully, "because I asked around about you, about what happened, about what you did, and what was done to you, and what kind of woman walks out of a situation like yours, with her child in her arms, and her head still up." He looked at her directly. "The kind of woman this ranch needs. That's what I told him, and that's what I meant." Claire did not let anything show on her face. She had spent years learning not to let things show. But something inside her, something small and bruised and very tired, turned toward that sentence, the way a frost-bitten hand turns toward an open fire. The kind of woman this ranch needs. Not desperate enough to accept. Not broken enough to be grateful. Needed. "I don't make promises I don't intend to keep," she said, because she had to say something, and that was the truest thing she had. "And I don't forgive easily. I want you to know that before you've had time to form opinions about me." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then for the first time he almost smiled. "Good," he said. "I don't trust people who do, Jantarisar." Dinner that evening was exactly what Earl had described full loud. 15 people around 2 long tables pushed together, ranch hands with sunburned necks and battered hats hung on chairbacks. 2 women with children who introduced themselves as Ruth and May, an older man named Calhoun who had worked cattle for 40 years and now managed the south pasture from a rocking chair with his left leg elevated because of an old injury he dismissed as nothing worth discussing. A boy of about 12 who said his name was Poe. Just Poe. No other name offered, who looked at Lily with the cautious curiosity of a child who had learned not to get attached to things too quickly. Lily sat between Claire and Ethan eating cornbread with focused concentration, and occasionally slipping pieces of it under the table where Governor had positioned himself with enormous patience. "He's not supposed to be inside during meals," Ethan said without looking up from his plate. "He came in himself," Lily said. "He does that." "Is he in trouble?" "He's always in trouble," Ethan said. "It doesn't seem to bother him." Ruth from across the table caught Claire's eye and smiled, a real smile, not a polite one. "It gets easier," she said quietly. "The first week is the strangest. After that, it just starts to feel like home." "How long have you been here?" Claire asked. "2 winters. I came with my girls after my husband passed. Ethan gave us the second cabin and said we could stay as long as we needed." She glanced down the table toward Hayes, who was listening to Calhoun with the concentrated expression of a man trying to solve a problem. "He hasn't once made me feel like a charity case. I think about that a lot." Claire thought about Margaret Holloway in the dry goods store, a child's picture book, the kind with colored illustrations. After dinner, while the hands cleared the tables, and Poe showed Lily the bookshelves in the main room, with the hesitant showing-off energy of a child who wanted very much to impress someone, Ethan came and stood beside Claire at the window. They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, the mountains were enormous and dark, and starred above the tree line. "You're wondering whether to trust any of this," he said. "I'm always wondering that," she said. "That's fair." He was quiet for a beat. "I'm not going to ask you not to. Trust gets built. It doesn't get declared." He turned slightly to look at her profile. "All I'll ask is that you tell me when something isn't working. Don't carry it and say nothing. I can fix what I know about. I can't fix what people hide from me." Claire looked at Lily's dark head bent over a book beside Poe, the shepherd sprawled across both their feet like a living rug. "She hasn't laughed like that since before the marriage ended." she said before she could decide whether to say it. Ethan said nothing. He didn't try to smooth it over or make it mean something convenient. He just let it be true. After a moment, Claire said, "Thank you for the book." He looked at her. "Margaret Holloway told me," she said. "About the illustrated picture book and the boots question." He was quiet for a second. Something about the set of his jaw told her he hadn't expected Margaret to share that. "I wanted her to have something here when she arrived," he said finally, "so it didn't feel like landing in a strange place with nothing familiar." Claire turned back to the window. Her hands were folded against the glass cold through the pane. "Nobody has ever done that," she said, asked what she needed before meeting her. "Nobody has ever thought about Lily that way ahead of time, just to make her comfortable." Her voice was steady. She was still good at that. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Ethan said simply. "It's just the truth." The fire in the main room popped. Lily turned a page. Governor's tail thumped once against the floorboards. Claire stood at that window and felt for the first time in longer than she could carefully count that she was somewhere. The walls did not feel like they were narrowing. She did not let herself trust it, but she noted it. And she was still noting it when she carried her sleeping daughter upstairs, to the room Ethan had prepared, a room with a small iron bed and a quilt, and on the windowsill a single illustrated picture book propped up so it would be the first thing Lily saw when she woke. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment after she'd settled her daughter in, looking at that book. Then she pressed her back against the doorframe exactly the way she had pressed herself against the hallway wall in her father's house 2 days ago, and let herself feel the full weight of what it meant to be somewhere that someone had thought ahead of time to make room for your child. It didn't feel like rescue. It didn't feel like charity. It felt in some frightening, unfamiliar way she did not yet have language for, like the beginning of something she had stopped letting herself believe existed. She was careful not to name it, but she did not walk away from it either. She did not sleep well that first night. That was nothing new. Claire lay in the dark of the small room Ethan had prepared for her clean linens, a pitcher of water on the stand, a window that faced east, and listened to the ranch settle around her the way an unfamiliar house always settles. The creak of timber, the distant movement of cattle, the low sound of wind pressing against the shutters. She catalogued sounds the way she'd trained herself to do in Daniel's house, sorting them into safe and unsafe, familiar and unknown. Old habit. Ugly habit. The kind that kept you alive and cost you sleep in equal measure. Through the wall she could hear Lily's breathing. Slow and deep. Her daughter could sleep anywhere through anything, which had been both a mercy and a source of quiet grief. During the worst years, a 6-year-old should not have to be that practiced at sleeping through tension. She was still awake when the first light came through the window. She dressed before anyone else was moving and went downstairs. Ethan was already in the kitchen. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised. "Coffee's made," he said, and went back to reading what appeared to be a ledger spread open on the kitchen table, a pen in his hand. Claire poured herself a cup and sat down across from him, and they said nothing to each other for almost 10 minutes, which was, she thought, the most comfortable she had felt in a room with a man in several years. "I want to make myself useful," she said finally. He looked up. "Today," she said, "I'm not going to sit in a room waiting to be told where I fit. Tell me what needs doing." He studied her for a moment with those steady, unhurried eyes. "Ruth handles the kitchen rotation. Calhoun manages the pasture schedule. The thing that actually needs attention is the account ledgers. They're 3 months behind, because the man who used to keep them rode out in October and didn't come back. I can do that. You know bookkeeping. I ran my father's household accounts from the time I was 16, she said. He didn't know, because the man he paid to do it was spending half the budget on whiskey, and I fixed it without telling anyone. But yes, I know bookkeeping. Something crossed Ethan's face that might have been amusement. "The ledger's yours," he said, and slid it across the table. That was how it started. Nesrartak. By the end of the first week, Claire had reorganized 4 months of accounts, identified 2 consistent billing errors from the supply merchant in town, and calculated that the ranch had been overpaying for winter grain at a rate that would have become genuinely damaging within another season. She left the corrected figures on the kitchen table for Ethan without comment. He found them after supper. He stood at the table for a long time reading through her work, and then he looked up at her across the room with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. "You found this in a week," he said. "It was in the numbers," she said. "The numbers don't hide things. People hide things. The numbers just record what the people did." "The merchant's name is Aldous Crane," Ethan said. "He's been supplying this ranch for 8 years. I know. That's why he thought he could do it." She met his eyes steadily. "Do you want to confront him yourself, or would you rather I draft the letter?" Ethan looked at her for another moment. Then he said quietly, "I'll draft it. But I want your name on it." She blinked. That was not what she had expected. "Why?" "Because he needs to understand it wasn't a mistake he can explain away," Ethan said. "He needs to understand somebody looked carefully, and somebody is still looking." She nodded slowly. "All right." He held her gaze a beat longer than necessary. "You're not what your father described," he said. "What did he describe? A problem to be managed." He picked up the ledger. He was wrong. He said it simply without performance, and walked out of the kitchen before she could formulate a response which was perhaps merciful because she did not have one ready. Lily, meanwhile, was conducting her own separate negotiations with the ranch's social order and winning. By the third day, she had established a firm alliance with Poe, the 12-year-old who slept in the bunkhouse and had attached himself to the ranch the previous spring, under circumstances nobody discussed, and Ethan apparently never demanded be discussed. They communicated primarily in a language composed of animal-related observations, book references, and the kind of wordless collaborative problem-solving that children develop when adult conversation has taught them that words are often unreliable. Governor followed them both everywhere, like a self-appointed guardian of questionable effectiveness and enormous self-regard. Ruth watched all of this from the kitchen door one afternoon and said to Claire standing beside her, "Poe hasn't had a friend his own age since he got here. Just thought you should know." Claire watched her daughter crouch down to show Poe something in the dirt. She couldn't see what from this distance, but Poe leaned in with the focused attention of someone receiving important information. "Lily hasn't either," Claire said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "Were you afraid coming here not knowing him?" Claire considered lying, old reflex. Then she set it aside. "I was terrified," she said. "I thought it would be another version of the same thing. A different house, different walls, same rules." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I didn't know what to do with a man who wasn't trying to manage me." Ruth nodded, like that answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. "He's not perfect," she said. "He gets quiet when something's bothering him, and he won't say what it is until it's already resolved itself. He overworks. He carries too much." She paused. "But he never makes you feel like your being here is conditional, like you're on approval." She glanced at Claire. "That's rarer than it should be." Claire knew that better than most. The first real test came on a Thursday, 10 days after she'd arrived in the middle of an argument she hadn't known she was about to walk into. She heard the raised voices coming from the main room before she reached the door. Ethan's voice controlled but hard at the edges, and another male voice she didn't recognize louder, with the particular pitch of a man accustomed to volume-solving problems for him. She pushed the door open. A heavy-set man in a good coat stood in the center of the room with the posture of someone who owned the ground he stood on, regardless of whose name was on the deed. 2 younger men flanked him slightly behind hired presence, not workers. Ethan stood facing him, arms crossed, jaw set. "This is a private conversation," the heavy-set man said, looking at Claire. "This is my house," Ethan said without looking away from the man. "She goes where she pleases in it." The man's eyes moved over Claire with the kind of appraisal that made her skin tighten. Not predatory exactly, but dismissive in a way that was its own particular insult. "The Bennett girl," he said, like placing a piece on a board. Gerald's daughter. Miss Bennet, Ethan said. His voice had gone quieter, which she was beginning to understand meant it had gone colder. My name is Harlan Voss, the man said, turning slightly toward Claire, as though including her was a concession he'd chosen to make. I own the Eastern Grazing Range, and I've had an ongoing arrangement with this ranch regarding shared water access. Your Mr. Hayes seems to believe I've violated the terms. You diverted the creek? Ethan said flatly. 20 feet upstream. Our south pasture has been running dry for 6 weeks, and your new irrigation channel explains it entirely. I improved my infrastructure. You stole water, Ethan said, from people who depend on it. The room was very quiet. Claire stayed near the door, reading the room the way she'd learned to read rooms who held their body tense, who was ready to move where the actual threat lived versus where it performed itself. Voss's eyes slid back to her. He smiled the kind of smile that meant he was trying a different approach. Surely a woman with your background understands the importance of not making enemies, Miss Bennet. Starting fresh new place, new circumstances. He spread his hands with practiced generosity. It would be a shame for tensions here to affect your family's situation. There it was. Claire took a breath, let it out slowly. Mr. Voss, she said pleasantly. I kept my family's accounts for 10 years without credit for it, left a legal marriage with $14 in my pocket, and crossed 2 mountain passes in January with a 6-year-old on my lap. She tilted her head slightly. If you think threatening my circumstances is going to produce the response you're hoping for, I'd like to gently suggest you've miscalculated. Absolute silence. Ethan did not move. But something in his posture shifted a kind of involuntary stillness, like a man fighting the impulse to smile at an inopportune moment. Voss stared at Claire for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back at Ethan. We'll discuss this through proper channels, he said stiffly. Yes, Ethan agreed. We will. And you'll want to have the diversion reversed before that conversation happens. Voss left. His 2 silent companions followed. The door shut behind them with more force than was strictly necessary. The room breathed. Ethan turned and looked at Claire. He said nothing for a moment. I didn't need you to do that, he said finally. I know, she said. I wanted to. A pause. Then, he'll make trouble. Men like that always do, she said. That's not a reason to let them speak to people however they please. Ethan studied her with an expression she was starting to be able to read careful genuine, a little like a man recalibrating something he'd thought he understood. Thank you, he said simply. She nodded and went back to the ledgers. 3 days later, the storm hit. It came down from the northern ridge faster than anyone had predicted, a brutal dropping temperature system that turned from wind to blizzard inside 2 hours. The hands got the cattle into the lower pasture before the worst of it arrived. Most of the ranch community was inside, accounted for safe. Most. Calhoun came to the main house at a limping run, which for Calhoun, with his injured leg, meant something had gone genuinely wrong. 3 men from the North crew, he said, not waiting to catch his breath. They went up to check the fence line this morning before the storm shifted. They ain't back. The room went tight and focused immediately, the particular kind of focus that comes to people who have lived close to danger and know the difference between a problem and a crisis. Ethan was already pulling his coat on. Earl, he said, get the rope and the lanterns. Calhoun, which section of the north fence? Could be any of 3 spots. They split up to cover ground. Ethan turned to Ruth. Keep everyone inside. Keep the fire in the main room going. If we're not back in 4 hours... We'll be back, Claire said. Every head in the room turned. She had her coat in her hands. Her boots were already on. She looked at Ethan with an expression that did not invite debate. You need someone who can manage a rope and doesn't panic, she said. I can do both. You have a child here. Who is inside with Ruth and Poe and Governor and is safer in this building than those 3 men are on that ridge? She held his gaze. Don't waste time arguing with me, Ethan. You know I'm right. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he said, You stay within voice range of me at all times. Agreed. If I say come back, you come back. No argument. Agreed. He picked up the second coil of rope and handed it to her. Chabanks. The wind was a living thing with opinions about them specifically. They moved in a line. Earl first with the lantern, then Ethan, then Claire, then two hands named Marcus and George, who had been with the ranch longest. They used the rope between them as a lifeline, communicating in short shouts over the wind, when direction changed hand signals, when shouting cost too much. Claire had been cold before. Real cold, the kind that makes your joints ache and your thinking slow. This was colder than that. She focused on Ethan's back directly in front of her, on the tension in the rope, on the steady rhythm of placing each foot with purpose, rather than simply moving forward. They found the first man, a hand named Fletcher, in a low hollow near the fence line's second post, half sheltered by the drift that had built against the wood. He was conscious barely, and too cold to stand without support. Marcus and George took him between them. The second man found them came stumbling out of the white, in a direction none of them had been searching, and Earl caught him by the collar before he walked past in the wrong direction. That left one. A young hand named Thomas, 19 years old, first full winter on the ranch. They called for him for 20 minutes. The wind swallowed the sound of their voices with complete indifference. Ethan stopped. Claire came up beside him. They stood together in the howling white, and she could feel the tension in him, the weight of responsibility that a man carries when other people's safety lives inside it. He went northeast, she said. The wind is coming southwest. If he's trying to move towards sound, he'd angle northeast instinctively. Ethan looked at her. It's what I'd do, she said. Head into the wind so it doesn't push you further off course. A beat. Then he turned northeast and she followed. They found Thomas 40 yards further, sitting with his back against a rock, arms wrapped around his knees, doing exactly what you're supposed to do when you're lost in a storm. Stop moving and make yourself findable. He looked up when the lantern light hit him. His face cracked open with pure, overwhelmed relief. Mr. Hayes, he managed. Let's go, Ethan said and pulled him upright. On the way back with Thomas leaning between them and the wind beginning barely to drop, Ethan glanced at Claire over the boy's head. She felt it rather than saw it, that brief weighted look. She did not say anything, neither did he. But something passed between them in that cold and dark that could not have passed between two people sitting warm by a fire. Something forged specifically by shared difficulty, by the particular trust of moving through dangerous ground alongside someone and discovering they do not flinch. Back at the ranch, the main room erupted into the organized chaos of warming bodies and passing blankets, and Ruth producing hot broth from a pot she'd clearly kept ready because she was the kind of woman who kept things ready. Fletcher and the second man recovered quickly. Thomas took longer, but was coherent within the hour, embarrassed and grateful in equal measure. At some point in the middle of all of it, Claire felt a small hand slip into hers from the side. She looked down. Lily was standing beside her in her nightgown hair, loose gray eyes wide and very serious. I heard people come back, Lily said. I counted. Everyone's back, Claire said. I counted you too, Lily said. When you left. Claire crouched down and pulled her daughter against her chest without a word. Lily's arms went around her neck with a grip that communicated everything she was too young to say precisely, and too intelligent not to feel. Across the room, Ethan was speaking quietly with Thomas, one hand on the younger man's shoulder. He looked up and found Claire's eyes over the top of Lily's head. He didn't smile. Neither did she. But they held each other's gaze for one moment, one long, quietly significant moment, and in that look was something neither of them had said out loud, and neither of them had to. This place was real. The people in it were real. And Claire Bennett, who had spent 4 years learning to survive walls closing in, was beginning slowly, carefully, in the way of a woman who has very good reasons not to feel something she'd stopped allowing herself to name. She pressed her face into her daughter's hair. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, every single person was accounted for. For now, that was enough. The morning after the storm, the ranch ran on the particular quiet energy of people who had survived something together and were still processing what that meant. Fletcher's hands were blistered from the cold. Thomas had a cough that Ruth was treating with strong tea, and the kind of firm maternal authority that brooked no argument. The cattle in the lower pasture were intact. The north fence had 3 posts down that would need replacing when the ground thawed enough to dig. Ethan was already writing the supply list when Claire came downstairs. She poured her coffee. She sat across from him. They said good morning to each other the same way they always did, brief, direct, comfortable, and she did not examine too closely how quickly that had become ordinary. What was not ordinary was what Earl brought in with the morning mail. He set the envelope on the table between them without a word. Claire saw her own name on the front, Miss Claire Bennett, care of Hayes Ranch, in the formal printed hand of a legal document. Her stomach dropped before she even touched it. Ethan watched her face. She opened it. She read it once. Then she set it flat on the table very carefully, the way you set down something fragile that you do not want to shatter in front of other people. "Daniel is filing for custody of Lily," she said. The kitchen went absolutely silent. "He's claiming I'm an unfit mother," she continued, and her voice was steady, which was a small miracle because nothing else inside her was. "Unstable living situation. Insufficient means. He's got a lawyer named Croft out of Helena and a court date in 6 weeks." Ethan put down his pen. "Read me the specifics," he said. She did. Every word. Her voice didn't break once. When she finished, she folded the paper precisely along its original creases and set it down again. "He doesn't want her," she said. "He never wanted her. When I was pregnant, he told me a daughter was a waste of 9 months. Her jaw tightened. "This is my father's money and my father's strategy. He's furious that I'm not miserable. He's furious that you worked. So he found a weapon." "Lily is not a weapon." "No," Claire said. "But she's mine. And that makes her one to him." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We're going to need a lawyer." "I know. I know a man in Butte, James Aldridge. He handled water rights for the county 3 years back, and he won against people with considerably more money than Daniel Brooks. Lawyers cost money." "Yes?" Ethan said simply. "They do." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them made a speech about it. "I'll write to Aldridge today," he said, and picked up his pen. Moig. She did not tell Lily immediately. She spent 2 days carrying it alone during meals, during the ledger work, during the evenings when Lily read beside the fire with Poe and Governor sprawled between them, and everything looked from a certain angle like exactly what it was starting to become. Ruth found her sitting alone on the back steps on the second evening, which was the kind of thing Ruth seemed to have an instinct for. She sat down beside Claire without asking if company was wanted. "You're going to wear a hole in yourself," Ruth said. "I'm thinking." "You've been thinking for 2 days. You've got the face of a woman who's been thinking for 2 days. Claire exhaled. "I don't know how to tell her. She's 6. She knows her father is someone who hurt us. She doesn't need to know he's trying to use the law to take her back." "No," Ruth agreed. "But she's going to feel something's wrong if you keep looking like that. Children always do." She was quiet for a beat. "My girls knew something was wrong when my husband was sick months before I told them. They just knew. And the not knowing what exactly was worse than the knowing." Claire looked at her hands in her lap. "She asked me last week," she said quietly, "whether we were going to stay. She didn't say stay here specifically. She just said, 'Are we going to stay?' Like she was afraid to attach the place to the question in case I said no." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was working on it." Ruth nodded. "That was honest." "It didn't feel like enough. It never does." Ruth stood smoothing her skirt. "Tell her something true, Claire. Children can carry true things. What they can't carry is feeling alone with their own fear." She told Lily that night after the house settled, sitting on the edge of her daughter's bed in the dark. She kept it simple. She kept it true. She said that Lily's father had asked a judge to decide where Lily should live, and that Claire was going to talk to the judge and explain everything, and that no matter what happened in any courtroom, Claire was never going to stop fighting for her. Lily listened without moving. When Claire finished, Lily was quiet for a long moment. "Will the judge believe you?" she asked. "I'm going to make sure he does." "What if Daddy lies?" "Then I'll have the truth," Claire said. "And the truth leaves Mark's baby. It doesn't go away just because someone talks louder than it." Lily thought about this seriously. "Is Mr. Ethan going to help?" "Yes." Another pause. "Does he know that you—" Lily stopped. Started again. "Does he know that Daddy used to be scary?" Claire breathed through the tightness in her chest. "He knows enough. And he's still helping." "Yes?" Lily pulled her quilt up to her chin and stared at the ceiling for a moment, with the particular expression of a child processing something that is too large for her age and too real to pretend otherwise. "Okay," she said finally, in a small, certain voice. Claire pressed a kiss to her forehead and sat beside her until her breathing evened out into sleep, and then she sat a little longer in the dark, because she needed a minute that was just hers. James Aldridge arrived 12 days later, a compact, brisk man in his 40s, with sharp eyes and the efficient, no-performance manner of someone who won cases by understanding them completely, rather than by performing them dramatically. He sat across from Claire at the kitchen table and asked her questions for 3 hours straight. Not gentle questions. Hard ones, the kind a hostile attorney would ask, because Aldridge was smart enough to know that the only preparation that worked was preparation for the worst version of the opposition. "Your father will testify against you," he said. "You understand that?" "Yes." "He'll frame the departure from your marriage as instability rather than escape. He'll argue the current arrangement is irregular. He'll suggest that a woman who accepts his word will probably be charity, from a man she's known less than 2 months, demonstrates poor judgment." "Let him," Claire said. Aldridge looked at her steadily. "Most of my clients say that, and then fall apart on the stand. I'm not most of your clients." "What makes you different?" "I've been telling the truth about Daniel Brooks for 4 years and nobody listened," she said. "I'm not afraid of saying it in a room where someone has to write it down." Aldridge studied her for a moment. Then he nodded a short, precise nod, the kind that meant she'd passed something. "I need names," he said. "Anyone who witnessed anything in that marriage, household staff, neighbors, a doctor if there were injuries documented. There was a doctor in Millfield, Dr. Warren. He treated me twice and wrote it as accidents in his record, but he knew." She paused. "He looked at me when he wrote it. He knew, and he was sorry, and he didn't say a word." "Would he say one now?" "I don't know, but I think if someone asked him directly in a formal setting, he might find it harder to keep writing accidents." Aldridge wrote a name. "Anyone else?" "The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrich." She thought of the woman pressing biscuits into her hands on the morning she left. Red eyes. No words. "She saw things. She never spoke of them. But she wept when I left, and I don't think it was grief at losing a good employer." Aldridge wrote another name. At the end of 3 hours, he closed his notebook and said, "You have a case, Miss Bennett. It's not a simple one, and it'll be uncomfortable to make it, but you have one." "Good," she said. "Make it." Gencisati. What nobody anticipated was Harlan Voss. The evening before Aldridge was due to leave, Ethan came back from town with a jaw set tight enough to fracture stone, and Claire knew before he spoke that something had moved sideways. "Voss met with Daniel Brooks's lawyer in town this afternoon," he said. "Earl saw them at the hotel." The kitchen went cold. "He's going to testify," Claire said. "Not a question." "I don't know that yet." "Yes, you do." She stood. "He's angry about the water rights. He's angry about what I said to him in this room. He can't get at you through the land, so he's going to get at you through me." She felt the anger move through her, like a current, clean and focused. "He's going to tell the court that I'm living in an irregular arrangement, that the ranch is a collection of charity cases, that Lily is being raised without appropriate—" Claire. She stopped. Ethan crossed the room and stood in front of her close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "Listen to me," he said. "Voss can say whatever he wants about this ranch. Let him. Every person in that courtroom who's ever needed a second chance in their life is going to hear him describe this place as charity, and they are going to know exactly what kind of man is speaking." She held his gaze, and as for the irregular arrangement, he stopped. Something moved through his expression, careful and deliberate, like a man who has thought a thing through completely before he says it. "That's something we can address." The kitchen was very quiet. "Ethan," she said slowly, "I'm not saying it the way your father did it," he said immediately firmly. "I'm not making an arrangement. I'm not making a deal." He held her gaze without flinching. "I'm asking you, plainly, whether you would consider marrying me not because it helps a legal case, but because I think you already know I would spend the rest of my life making sure you never had reason to regret it." Claire's heart was doing something complicated, and she chose specifically not to examine it in this moment. "That is not a romantic proposal," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's an honest one. I figured you'd prefer that." She stared at him. "I need time," she said. "You have it," he said simply, and stepped back. "Sag," she told Aldridge in the morning. He was characteristically direct about it. "It strengthens the case significantly. A stable married household versus a man who abandoned a child for 6 years and is now claiming paternal rights for financial motivation, the contrast is clear." "I'm aware of the legal argument," Claire said. "That's not why I'm asking." Aldridge looked at her over his coffee cup. "Then why are you—" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I want to know," she said carefully, "if it's possible to do something for 2 reasons at once, and have both of them be real." He put the cup down. "Miss Bennett, in my experience, most of the best decisions people make are for more than one reason. The trouble comes when people pretend they only have one." She sat with that all morning. It was Ruth who found her at noon, standing in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table and her eyes fixed on the middle distance. "He asked you," Ruth said. It was not a question. Claire didn't bother asking how she knew. "He did. And I don't know how to trust something that looks like what I wanted," Claire said. "I spent years in a house with a man who knew exactly how to look like what I wanted right up until he didn't bother anymore." Ruth sat down across from her. "Ethan Hayes," she said, "has never once in the 2 years I have lived in this house asked something of me in order to get something back from it. He doesn't operate that way." She paused. "You've been here 6 weeks. You've seen him every day, in crisis and in quiet, and in the middle of arguments, and in the dead of a blizzard." She leaned forward slightly. "What does your gut tell you?" Claire was quiet for a long time. "That he means it," she said finally. The admission cost her something. That he's the one person I've met in my adult life who means exactly what he says, and nothing extra and nothing hidden. "Then what are you actually afraid of?" The question landed in the center of Claire's chest and sat there perfectly placed, demanding an honest answer. "That I'm going to say yes," she said quietly. "And it's going to be real, and then something is going to take it away. The way things get taken away." She pressed her lips together. "I'm afraid of wanting something that much again." Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over Claire's. "I know," she said simply. They sat like that for a minute. Then Lily's voice came from the yard, bright and unself-conscious, calling Poe's name about something that clearly required immediate attention, and Claire closed her eyes for just a moment. She was afraid of wanting something that much, but she already wanted it. She'd wanted it since a man in a worn coat stood at a fence line with his hat in both hands and asked her daughter's permission before taking a single step. She pushed back from the table and walked to the door of the main room. Ethan was at the desk by the window writing. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him. "Yes," she said. He looked at her carefully like a man making sure he'd heard correctly. "Yes?" she said again, more certain. "Not because of the court case." Because I've watched you for 6 weeks treat every person on this ranch like they matter, including my daughter, including me, and I have run out of reasonable arguments against a man like that." Ethan stood up slowly. He was close enough that she could see the controlled steadiness in his face, the careful, deliberate way he was holding himself, because he understood exactly what it cost her to say that word. "I won't give you reason to regret it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said yes." He reached out and took her hand, simply without ceremony, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep. Outside, Lily's voice rose on a laugh that carried clean through the walls of the house and into every room. The court date was in 3 weeks. Daniel Brooks was already in the county. And somewhere across town, Harlan Voss was deciding exactly how much damage a bitter man with a grudge and a willing ear could do to a woman who finally, after everything, had something worth protecting. Daniel Brooks was smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing Claire noticed when she walked into the county courthouse and found him already seated at the opposing table, smaller and harder, and wearing a suit that cost more than most men on the ranch made in 3 months. He had the look of someone who had spent the past 2 years being very angry and calling it righteousness. He did not look at her when she entered. That told her everything she needed to know about how he planned to play this. The performance of indifference. The careful staging of a man who had already won and knew it, and found the proceedings beneath him. She had watched him do this for 4 years in their marriage, perform unconcerned so thoroughly that anyone watching believed the battle was already decided. She sat down beside Aldridge, folded her hands on the table, and looked straight ahead. Ethan was in the gallery behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know exactly where he was sitting. Aldridge leaned slightly toward her. "Croft is going to open with the living arrangement," he murmured. "He'll make the ranch sound like a transient camp. Let him finish. Don't react." "I never react," she said quietly. "I know. That's going to unsettle them." Gerald Bennett was seated 3 rows back in the gallery. She had seen him when she came in. He was watching her with the expression of a man waiting to watch a building burn that he himself had set fire to. She did not look at him again. The judge was a man named Hargrove, 60, bald at the crown, with the tired, measured manner of someone who had listened to too many people lie to him over too many years and had developed an extremely accurate internal instrument for detecting it. He called the room to order. Croft opened exactly as Aldridge had predicted. He was smooth, practiced. He used words like instability and impulsive relocation and irregular domestic circumstances with the ease of a man who understood that language deployed correctly could make truth sound like confusion. He described the Hayes Ranch as a collection of transients and charity cases. He described Claire's departure from her marriage as reckless abandonment of a stable home. He described Daniel Brooks as a father denied access to his daughter through no fault of his own, a man seeking only to ensure the welfare of a child currently residing in conditions no reasonable person would consider suitable. Claire kept her face still throughout. Beside her, she felt Aldridge's pen moving steadily. When Croft finished, Hargrove looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has heard this particular song before and found it unremarkable. "Mr. Aldridge," he said. Aldridge stood. He did not open with Claire. He opened with dates. Dates of medical visits. Dates recorded in Dr. Warren's ledger in Millfield. Every visit, every notation, every careful clinical entry of injuries that the ledger described as accidental, and that Aldridge now read into the record one by one slowly, in the particular silence of a room, beginning to understand what it was hearing. Croft objected 3 times. Hargrove overruled him twice and sustained once, which was a ratio that told its own story. Then Aldridge called Dr. Warren. He was a small man, Warren, and he came to the stand with the posture of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally been given permission to set it down. He was sworn in. He looked at his hands. He looked at Claire. She held his gaze steadily, without anger. She had thought about this moment, had imagined herself furious, had imagined herself cold, had imagined herself demanding accountability with her eyes. But sitting here in this room, looking at this man who had been afraid and had stayed silent and had spent 2 years knowing what that silence cost her, she felt mostly tired, and something close to pity. Aldridge asked him about the first visit. Warren described it. He described the second. By the time he described the third, the room was so quiet that the scratch of the court recorder's pen was the loudest sound in it. "In your professional opinion," Aldridge said, "were these injuries consistent with the accidents recorded in your ledger?" Warren's jaw worked for a moment. "No," he said. "They were not." "Why did you record them as such?" A long pause. "Mr. Brooks was a prominent man," Warren said, "and I was—" He stopped. "I was afraid of what it would cost me to say otherwise." "And what does it cost you to say so now?" Warren looked at Claire again. Something in his face broke open just slightly. "Less than it should have cost me then," he said. The gallery was murmuring when Aldridge called Mrs. Aldrich. She walked to the stand with her hands clasped and her chin up, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was not going to be moved from it by any force available in this room. She was sworn in. She looked directly at Croft when he tried to catch her eye in warning, and then she looked away from him as though he were of no further interest. Aldridge asked her what she had witnessed in 4 years of service in the Brooks household. She told him. She told him with the precise, specific memory of a woman who had catalogued things in silence and never forgotten a single detail, because some part of her had always known this day might come. She told him about the night Claire had come downstairs with her left arm held awkwardly and said she'd tripped, and the look on Daniel's face when he watched her say it. She told him about the morning Lily had stopped crying when her father entered a room, not the natural quiet of a child who sees a parent, but the held-breath stillness of a small animal that has learned which movements draw attention. The room was very still. Croft stood. "Objection. This is speculation about a child's internal—" "The child's behavior is observable fact," Aldridge said without turning. "Mrs. Aldrich is describing what she witnessed." Hargrove looked at Croft. "Overruled." Daniel Brooks at the opposing table was looking at his own hands. It was the first time he had moved since Mrs. Aldrich began speaking. Gerald Bennett, 3 rows back, was no longer watching the proceedings with the expression of a man who had already won. He was watching with the expression of a man recalculating something rapidly and finding the numbers increasingly unfavorable. Then Croft called Harlan Voss. He was as smooth on the stand as he'd been in Ethan's main room, comfortable in his own authority, practiced at presenting himself as a reasonable man, offering reluctant observations. He described the ranch as a transient operation. He described Ethan Hayes as a man of uncertain prospects who accumulated dependent people. He used the word irregular 4 separate times. Claire kept her hands flat on the table. Aldridge let Voss finish completely before he stood. "Mr. Voss," he said pleasantly, "you have an ongoing water rights dispute with Hayes Ranch, is that correct?" A pause. "It's a civil matter," Voss said. "Initiated by you, resolved last month by county order in Hayes Ranch's favor, resulting in a financial penalty assessed against your property. Is that correct?" The pause was longer this time. "That's correct," Voss said. "And your testimony today was arranged in consultation with Mr. Brooks's legal counsel approximately 2 weeks ago before you had been called as any kind of formal witness. Is that also correct?" Voss's face changed. "I was asked to provide testimony," Aldridge said, "in a custody hearing against a woman you met once, in whose home you received—" He glanced at his notes. "A straightforward and factually accurate response to a veiled threat you made to her during an unannounced visit." He looked up. "Would you characterize that as an objective account of the fitness of a mother and her living situation?" "Mr. Voss." "Or would you characterize it as a grudge, dressed up in legal language?" Voss opened his mouth, closed it. Hargrove looked at him over his spectacles with the expression of a man who had seen this particular shape of testimony before and found it exactly as convincing as expected. "You may step down, Mr. Voss," the judge said. "Son." There was a recess at noon. Claire stood in the corridor outside with Ethan on one side and Aldridge on the other, and she felt the morning sitting in her bones, like a weight she'd been carrying uphill for a very long time. "You're doing well," Aldridge said. "What's left?" Brooks himself, and then, he hesitated a fraction. "Croft may call Lily." Claire's spine went rigid. "He can't." "He can request it. Hargrove has discretion. Given her age, he'll likely decline." Aldridge met her eyes steadily. "But I want you prepared, if he doesn't." She turned and found Ethan looking at her. "She's strong," he said quietly. "She's 6. "She's your daughter," he said. "She is absolutely, completely strong." Claire pressed her lips together, nodded once. Across the corridor, she saw her father emerge from the courtroom. He walked toward her with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man performing confidence. He stopped 3 feet away. "This doesn't have to continue," he said in a low voice. "You can drop the counterclaim. Daniel takes partial custody. You take support payments. Everyone moves on without—" "Without what?" Claire said. Gerald's jaw tightened. "Without embarrassing this family further." "I've been embarrassing this family," Claire said, "since the day I refused to tell the doctor I tripped. So that ship father has well and truly sailed." She looked at him directly. "And if you use that word embarrassment in the context of what happened to me one more time, I will find a way to make sure every person in this county knows the exact nature of the deal you made to remove your daughter from your house, and call it generosity." Gerald stared at her. "We're done talking," she said. She turned back to Ethan and Aldridge and did not look at her father again. Daniel took the stand in the afternoon. Croft walked him through his prepared answers with the practiced ease of a well-rehearsed performance-devoted father, patient husband, a man who had supported his wife and daughter and been abandoned without cause. His voice was measured. His manner was reasonable. His hands were still in his lap. He was very good at this. Claire had always known he was good at this. It was Aldridge's cross-examination that took him apart slowly, with the quiet precision of a man who had read every document and believed in the power of specificity. "You stated that you provided financial support for your daughter following the separation." "That's correct." "Could you give the court the total amount provided in the 14 months between the separation and today's filing?" Daniel shifted slightly. "I don't have the exact figure." "I have it," Aldridge said. "The exact figure documented and submitted to this court is $0. Is there an error in that documentation?" A silence. There were difficulties. The difficulty, Aldridge said evenly, was not financial. Your income in the same period is also documented and submitted. You chose not to provide support. You made that choice for 14 months, and then you filed for custody. Help me understand the logic of that for the court, Mr. Brooks." Daniel looked at Croft. Croft could not help him. "I wanted her with me," Daniel said. "Support payments imply a permanent separation. I didn't accept." "You didn't accept that your wife had the right to leave you," Aldridge said. Croft shot to his feet. "Objection." "Withdrawn," Aldridge said, and sat down. The damage was done. The room knew it. Then Judge Hargrove did something no one had anticipated. He did not call Lily to the stand. Instead, he recessed the court for 30 minutes and requested that a court officer speak with the child privately in his chambers. A standard practice for young children in custody matters, but one that Croft had not prepared for and Aldridge had quietly requested 3 days earlier. Claire sat in the corridor on a wooden bench with her hands in her lap and stared at the wall across from her and tried to breathe normally. Ethan sat beside her. He didn't try to talk. He didn't offer reassurances she would have had to work to believe. He simply sat there, solid and present and real. And after a few minutes without either of them planning it, Claire's shoulder was against his arm and she let it stay there. Ruth had brought Lily into town that morning. She had braided Lily's hair and dressed her in her good gray dress and told her she was going to talk to a man who wanted to understand what made her happy, which was the truest possible version of what was about to happen. Lily had said, "Can Governor come?" Ruth had said, "Probably not inside the courthouse, sweetheart." Lily had thought about this and said, "Okay, but tell him I'll be back." Claire, sitting on that bench, remembered this and felt something release in her chest, a small, involuntary relaxation of the terror she'd been holding since morning. Her daughter was going to be fine. Whatever was being said in that room, Lily was going to be fine, because Lily was the most fundamentally herself person Claire had ever known, and no courthouse and no court officer could change that. 30 minutes later, Hargrove reconvened. He looked at both tables for a long moment. "I've spoken with the child," he said. "I'm going to read into the record one statement she made with her permission, which she gave clearly and without prompting." He looked down at the paper in front of him. "She said," and his voice shifted slightly with something he controlled before it became fully visible, "Mr. Ethan is the first man who ever made me feel safe. I don't want to leave. This is the only place where nobody is scared." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Gerald Bennett, 3 rows back, looked at the floor. Daniel Brooks looked at the wall. Claire looked at nothing. She was holding the tears behind her eyes by main force and concentration, and she was not going to release them in this room, not in front of these people. Not today. Ethan's hand found hers under the table. She held it without looking at him. Hargrove set the paper down. "I've heard sufficient testimony," he said. "I'll have a decision by Friday morning." Friday came like all impossible mornings, come too fast and too slow. Simultaneously, the hours before dawn, stretching out interminably, and then the sun arriving with indecent speed, and suddenly Claire was in the corridor outside Hargrove's courtroom again, with Aldridge on one side and Ethan on the other, and the sound of her own heartbeat very loud in her ears. Aldridge had said the night before that he was confident. He'd said it with the careful qualifier of a man who had been confident before and learned what overconfidence costs. She had not slept. She had lain in the dark beside Lily's room and listened to her daughter breathe and thought about every version of what happened next, what she would do, where they would go, how she would explain, because Claire Bennett had survived by always having a plan, always knowing the next step, always refusing to be caught without somewhere to move. She had 6 contingencies planned by 4 in the morning and had discarded all of them because none of them were the thing she actually wanted, and she was done, she decided somewhere around 5, pretending she didn't know exactly what she wanted and why. She wanted to stay. She wanted Lily to grow up in that house with that dog and that boy and those women and that rancher who bought picture books before he'd met the child they were for. She wanted it badly enough that it frightened her, which meant she had decided that it was real. Hargrove entered. The room stood. He sat. They sat. He opened the folder in front of him. He read for 30 seconds that felt like the length of a season. Then he looked up. "In the matter of Brooks versus Bennett," he said, "this court finds in favor of the respondent. Full custody of Lillian Brooks is awarded to her mother, Claire Bennett, effective immediately. The petitioner's claim is dismissed." He looked at Daniel Brooks over his spectacles with the measured, unimpressed gaze of a man who had heard every version of this story and knew exactly which version he'd heard today. "Mr. Brooks, this court strongly advises you to examine your motivations carefully before bringing further proceedings of this nature before any bench in this state." Daniel said nothing. Gerald Bennett stood up and walked out of the gallery before the gavel came down, and Claire watched him go with an expression that was not triumph and was not grief. It was something quieter and more final than either. The closing of a door that had been open too long. Aldridge was already gathering papers. Claire sat for one moment in the silence of a decision that had just changed everything, and she let it be real. Let it settle into her bones the way cold does, the way truth does, the way the things you've fought hardest for always do, slowly, completely, in a way that nothing can reverse. Then she turned to Ethan. He was watching her with that expression she had learned over 6 weeks to read: careful, quiet, absolutely certain. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She stood up. She straightened her coat. She picked up her bag. "I want to go home," she said. And for the first time in 4 years, that word home meant exactly what it was supposed to mean. The ride back to the ranch was 3 hours of mountain road, and Claire spent most of it with Lily pressed against her side and her daughter's hair against her cheek and her eyes on the passing pines without really seeing any of them. Lily talked the whole way. She talked about Governor and whether he'd been worried, and about the book Poe had promised to save her a chapter of, and about whether Ruth would make the cornbread tonight, because she'd been thinking about it since breakfast. And at some point in the middle of all of it, she said without transition, without looking up, "Daddy's not coming back, is he?" Claire tightened her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "No," she said. "He's not." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. And then, "Do you think Governor ate without me?" Claire pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head and closed her eyes. "Probably twice," she said. Lily giggled, and just like that, the weight of the morning shifted, not disappeared, not forgotten, but rearranged into something a 6-year-old could carry without being crushed by it, because children have a genius for that kind of rearrangement, and Lily Bennett had more of that genius than most. Ethan, seated across from them in the wagon, watched this exchange without saying anything. When Claire looked up and found his eyes, he simply nodded a small, steady acknowledgement that needed no translation. She nodded back. Oh, the ranch knew before they arrived. Earl had ridden ahead, which meant that by the time the wagon rolled through the gate, the yard had the particular organized chaos of people who have been waiting to celebrate something, and have had just enough time to prepare. Ruth was on the porch with her arms crossed and her eyes bright. Thomas, recovered fully from the storm, embarrassed still about the rescue, had his hat off and was turning it in his hands with a grin he couldn't contain. Calhoun had come out of the south pasture on his bad leg, which meant he'd been watching the road, and Poe was standing at the fence with Governor, both of them at complete attention, watching the wagon approach with identical expressions of focused anticipation. Lily was off the wagon before it fully stopped. She hit the ground running. Governor met her at full speed. The collision of small girl and large shepherd was catastrophic and joyful, and resulted in both of them on the ground. Lily laughing. Governor performing the critical task of face-washing with industrial thoroughness. Poe stood over them with his arms crossed, trying very hard to look like a 12-year-old who had not been counting hours. "You were gone a long time," he said. "We won," Lily informed him from the ground with her face full of dog. Poe's composure broke completely. He dropped to his knees and joined the pile, and Ruth on the porch made a sound that was specifically not crying and turned to go back inside, and Calhoun clapped Ethan on the shoulder with his weathered hand and said gruffly, "Good, good," which from Calhoun was a speech. Claire stood in the yard in the middle of all of it and felt the moment land in her body with the full weight of everything it meant. This was hers, all of it. Not on approval, not temporary. Not contingent on her being smaller or quieter or more grateful than she actually was. Hers. Ruth appeared at her elbow with coffee she had not asked for, which was Ruth's primary love language, and said quietly, "Welcome home." Claire took the coffee. She looked at the house, at the yard, at her daughter rolling in the dirt with a dog and a boy who had both been waiting for her. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping everything steady while we were gone." "Wasn't hard," Ruth said. "Everything here has roots now." She paused. "You put some of them down yourself, whether you noticed or not." They were married 3 weeks later. Not a large affair, not a performance. The circuit preacher came through on his regular route, and Claire had told Ethan she wanted it simple, and he had said simple suited him perfectly, and that had been the entire planning conversation. The household gathered in the main room, Ruth and her girls, Thomas and the hands Calhoun in his chair with his leg up, Poe, in a clean shirt that Ruth had clearly ironed with considerable effort against his will. Dr. Aldridge had ridden out from Butte because Ethan had asked him, and Claire had found herself oddly glad he was there. Lily stood beside her mother during the ceremony with Governor sitting at her feet, because someone had made the executive decision to allow him inside, and nobody was confessing to it. The preacher asked the words. They said the answers. Ethan took her hand, The same way he always took her hand without ceremony, without performance, like it was simply the right thing to do, and he was going to keep doing it. And when he put the ring on her finger, Claire looked at him directly and thought about the woman who had pressed herself against a hallway wall 8 weeks ago and listened to her father sell her to a stranger. That woman had survived. She had done more than survive. She had looked carefully at what she was being handed and refused to accept the version her father had described, and insisted on discovering the real thing for herself. She had been right. Ethan caught the look on her face and raised one eyebrow slightly a question. She shook her head slightly. Nothing. Everything. I'll tell you later. He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. The preacher pronounced them married. Lily threw her arms around both their waists simultaneously, which was geometrically complicated, but emotionally precise, and the room erupted into the specific warmth of people who have built something real together and are celebrating the fact that it continues. The months that followed moved the way good years move, full and fast and better understood in retrospect than in the living of them. Spring came. The damaged fence posts on the north line were replaced. The water rights case with Voss was formally closed by county order, with the diversion corrected and the penalty assessed, and Voss's name was not heard in the ranch's main room again. The supply merchant Crane wrote a contrite letter and adjusted his invoices going forward, which Aldridge predicted and Claire had counted on. 3 new families arrived at the ranch before summer. A widow with twin boys who came up from the southern valley, a former ranch hand with a busted shoulder who could no longer rope but had carpentry skills nobody had anticipated, and a woman named Esperanza, who had walked 40 miles from the nearest town with a toddler on her hip and nothing else. Ethan gave the widow the empty cabin on the east side. He put the carpenter to work on the new storage building. He gave Esperanza the room off the kitchen and didn't ask her a single question about where she'd come from or why. Claire watched him do all of this with the same uncomplicated steadiness he brought to everything, and one evening she said, "You do realize we're going to run out of room." "Then we'll build more room," he said without looking up from the supply list he was writing. "You can't just keep..." "Can't keep what?" She stopped. She thought about how to say it. "Taking people in," she finished. He looked up then. He put his pen down. "You think there's a limit," he said. "I think there are practical considerations." "There are always practical considerations," he said. "They're real, and they matter, and we address them as they come. But the reason we address them is so that they don't become an excuse for the other thing." He held her gaze. "There's no limit, Claire. That's the whole point of this place. That's why people come here instead of somewhere else." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to open a school," she said. He blinked. "For the children," she said. "There are 11 of them on this ranch right now. Poe taught himself to read from whatever he could find. Lily's ahead of where she should be because I've been teaching her myself since she was 4. The widow's boys can't read at all. This is fixable." "Yes," he said immediately. "I'll need the back room of the east cabin, and materials, and probably help from Ruth on the days when the accounting runs long." "Yes," he said again. "You're not going to negotiate any of that. Why would I?" He picked his pen back up. "You're right. It's fixable. Fix it." She stood there for the moment, looking at the top of his head bent over his work, and felt something she'd started to notice lately, a kind of quiet, specific gratitude that was different from the urgent, raw gratitude of the early weeks. This was steadier, more certain of itself, the kind that comes not from relief at having escaped something terrible, but from the clear-eyed recognition that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you were built for, beside exactly the right person. She went back to her own desk and started drafting the school plan. The school opened on the first Monday of September with 9 children, and Claire at the front of the room and a blackboard that Ethan and Thomas had installed the previous weekend and a box of chalk that Lily had personally inspected for quality. It was from the very first day a serious and functional operation. Claire taught the same way she did everything directly, completely without condescension. She expected the children to work. They did. Poe, who had appointed himself a de facto assistant with the younger ones, turned out to have a genuine gift for explaining things to small people that Claire noted and filed for future reference. By October, 2 families from neighboring spreads had asked whether their children could attend. By November, a rancher's wife from the valley sent a letter asking if Claire had ever considered expanding. Claire wrote back and said she was considering everything. The twist came in December, as the first real snow of winter settled over the ranch, and it came from nowhere Claire had anticipated. A letter arrived not from Daniel, not from her father, not from any of the directions she had spent months watching carefully. It came from her mother. Catherine Bennett had not spoken to Claire since before the marriage ended. She had not written. She had not appeared at the courthouse. She had been, as far as Claire could determine, entirely subsumed into the position Gerald Bennett had decided she should occupy, which was silence and compliance, and the performance of a family that had no problems it acknowledged. The letter was 4 paragraphs. Her mother's handwriting, small, precise, the handwriting of a woman who had been taught that taking up space was rude. Claire read it once. Then she put it down and sat very still. Ruth, who had the instinct, came in from the kitchen. "What is it?" "My mother," Claire said. "She says my father's business interests have collapsed. 3 of his major contracts fell through after the trial. Apparently, several of the men he worked with decided the association was no longer worth the risk." She stopped. "She says she's been thinking about leaving for 2 years. She says she didn't know where to go." Ruth was quiet. "She's asking," Claire said carefully, "whether there's room here." The silence stretched. "Is there?" Ruth asked. Claire thought about Ethan's voice in the study. "There's no limit. That's the whole point of this place." She thought about her mother's handwriting, small and careful. The handwriting of a woman who had been taught that taking up space was rude. She thought about the girl she had been at 16 running her father's accounts in secret because no one thought to give her the credit, and her mother in the next room saying nothing about either the injustice or the capability. She thought about what it cost to stay somewhere that required your silence. She already knew that price better than most. "I'll talk to Ethan," she said. She did. That evening, simply without a prepared speech. She told him what the letter said and what her mother was asking and what she thought about it, which was complicated and honest and not entirely resolved. Ethan listened completely. "What do you want?" he asked when she finished. "I don't know," she said. She didn't protect me. She watched what happened, and she stayed quiet, and she chose him every time. A pause. "But she's also a woman who's been told her whole life that staying quiet was the only safe thing. And I know what that feels like from the inside." "Yes," he said. "I'm not ready to forgive her." "You don't have to." "But I don't think I can tell her there's no room," she said. "Because that's not actually true, and I'm not going to lie about what this place is to make a point." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "Right back," he said simply. "Tell her she's welcome. Tell her it's not going to be easy between the 2 of you, and you're not going to pretend otherwise. And tell her that this place has one rule above all others." He met her eyes. "Nobody gets to be silent about the things that matter. Not anymore." Claire nodded slowly. "That's the right answer," she said. "It usually is," he said, and reached for her hand. It was Lily who said it. February. Deep winter. The main room full of the after-dinner warmth of 15 people, and the fire, and Governor hogging the best spot in front of the hearth. Lily was at the table with her book. Ethan was repairing a bridle nearby. Claire was at her desk with the school accounts. Poe asked Lily something Claire didn't catch what, and Lily looked up from her book and said completely without thinking, completely without any awareness of what she was doing, "Ask Dad, he'd know," and then went directly back to her book. The room went absolutely still. Ethan's hands stopped moving on the bridle. He did not look up immediately. He seemed to be having some kind of internal conversation that required all of his attention. His jaw worked once. He set the bridle down very carefully on the table beside him, like a man who needed something to do with his hands. Poe, with the exquisite social awareness of a 12-year-old, found something extremely interesting to look at in the middle distance. Lily. Several seconds later, registered the silence. She looked up. She looked at Ethan. She looked at her mother. Something crossed her face, understanding, and then a flash of uncertainty, and then something that was waiting to see whether it needed to become an apology. Claire looked at her daughter. Then she looked at Ethan. He had finally looked up. His eyes were bright in a way he was very clearly, very deliberately trying to manage with the focused effort of a man who has decided he is not going to cry in the main room of his own ranch in front of 15 people and is discovering that the decision and the execution are two different things. "It's all right," Claire said softly, to both of them. Lily looked at Ethan another moment. "Is it okay?" she asked him directly in her small, certain voice. Ethan cleared his throat, looked at the ceiling briefly, looked back at her. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said. His voice came out rougher than usual. "It's more than okay." Lily nodded satisfied and went back to her book. Governor shifted in front of the fire. Calhoun in his corner made a sound that was absolutely not a sniffle and would categorically deny being one. Ruth discovered something in the kitchen that required her immediate attention, and Claire sat at her desk and looked at the man she had married and thought about the woman who had pressed her back against a hallway wall and listened to her father laugh while making a deal he thought would finish her. That woman had crossed 2 mountain passes in January. She had corrected 4 months of accounts in 1 week. She had stood in a blizzard in the dark and found a lost boy by thinking like someone who refused to give up. She had stood in a courtroom and told the truth until the room had no choice but to hear it. She had built a school where 11 children, 12 now since the Morales family had arrived last week, were learning that their minds were worth developing and their futures were worth fighting for. She had not been rescued. She had arrived at a place that had room enough, and she had built the rest herself. One evening in early spring, with the snow finally retreating from the lower pastures and the first green coming back to the world, Claire found Ethan at the fence line, watching the cattle move into the new grass. She stood beside him. They were quiet together for a while, which they were very good at by now. A particular kind of quiet that didn't need filling, that was complete in itself. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. He turned his head and looked at her. "Choosing us," she said. "Before you knew us. Asking for us specifically. Whatever made you decide." He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but thinking the way he always thought before he said something that mattered. "I saw you once," he said, "in town, before any of this. You were coming out of the general store with Lily on your hip and 3 bags in your other hand, and a man said something to you, I didn't hear what, and you looked at him with that expression you have." He paused. "The one that says you've heard worse and survived it, and he's not worth the energy it would cost to respond." Claire said nothing. "I thought," he said, "that whatever that woman is building toward, I want to be part of it." He looked back at the cattle. Not to rescue her, not to fix her, just to be somewhere she could put that weight down for a while and have enough room to figure out what she actually was when nobody was trying to define her. Claire felt the words settle into her the way the best truths do, without drama, without requiring a response, simply true and complete and permanent. "You were never something broken I had to save," he said quietly. "You were the family I spent my whole life building this place for." She looked out at the ranch, at the cabins, at the new school building, at the children visible through the window, where Poe was helping the younger ones with their letters, at Ruth hanging laundry with Esperanza, while their children ran circles around their feet, at old Calhoun in his chair on the porch, with his face turned toward the returning sun, at all of it, living and real and continuing. She thought about Lily calling him Dad without thinking the most natural thing in the world. She thought about her own mother's letter sitting on the desk in her study, replied to, and sent a door open that might take years to walk through fully, and might never open all the way, and was worth opening regardless. She thought about standing in a blizzard in the dark, choosing to go forward. She had been told her whole life what she was worth, by her father's transactions and her husband's hands, and a town that watched and said nothing, and called her the disgrace of a family that had never deserved her loyalty. She knew now what she was worth. Not because someone had told her. Because she had spent 31 years building herself into exactly this woman, exactly here, and the evidence was everywhere she looked. "I know," she said. She took his hand. The mountain stood behind them, enormous and permanent, and entirely unconcerned with the opinions of small men in good suits. And Claire Bennett, who had been traded like broken goods, who had been laughed at by her own blood, who had crossed 2 passes in January with $14 and a 6-year-old, and a refusal to believe the story she'd been given about herself, stood in the returning spring of the Rocky Mountain West, and understood completely, and without reservation, that she had never been unwanted. She had simply been waiting for a place brave enough to hold everything she actually was, and she had built the rest herself. That was the truth. That had always been the truth. And no one, not ever again, was going to take it from her.